This worksheet, the whole point of this is to help you practice reducing your answers. Okay? Now, a big part of reducing your answer when dealing with the quadratic formula is simplifying the radical. So you've got to remember that process. Some of them are easier than others. Okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at number 1. We have the square root of 320. Question? Of course you can. Yeah, you can use a calculator. Okay, but remember, I don't want decimals as my answers. So you've got to know a process here, okay? Rather than just plugging and chugging and trying, there is a process here. So first off, square root of 320, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, okay? So what we're going to do then is we're going to make a list of perfect squares. So off to the side of the problem, make a list of perfect squares, go up to 225. Well, how do you make a list? If you don't have them memorized, how do you make the list? How am I supposed to write something down that I don't know? Remember what perfect squares are. What's the square root of 9? 3. So how do I get 9? 3 times 3. So that's what I do. I take 1 times 1. I take 2 times 2. I take 3 times 3. I take 4 times 4. You finish the list. What do we have then? We have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, yeah-huh, uh-huh, yep, 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 196, 225. Excellent. So, good. So there's our first 15 perfect squares. Now, the whole point of knowing that, you either have to have that memorized or you need to write down your list, is because that list helps you simplify this radical. What we do is, we've done it before, we take half of 320. Half of 320 is what? You're right, it's 160. So, 160 is not a perfect square. But it sits right about there, in between 144 and 169. So what we want to do then to simplify this is we want to start big. We want to start at 144 and work our way down the list. Okay? So take 320 divided by 144. Does it come out nice and even? No. No, it doesn't. So that one doesn't work. Try 320 divided by 121. No. 320 divided by 100. No. 320 divided by 81. No. 320 divided by 64.
Yes.
Yes. That one works. And so we rewrite our square root as the square root of 64 times the square root of 5. Well, the square root of 64 is 8. That's how we know what perfect square we're taking out, folks. That's the test. Yes, ma'am?
Oh, never mind. Wait, do we have to do plus or minus?
No. The square root was already there.
Okay.
Remember, the rule is if we're solving an equation and we put the square root in, we get 2 answers. If it's given to us, there's only one answer. The positive aspect. Okay? All right. So, that is simplifying. If you don't see it right away, you need to go through and simplify it down. You always need to simplify it down as far as you can. Because notice, 5 cannot be simplified down any farther, so we know we're done. Okay? All right. So there's number 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 10. Let's take a look at number 10. Okay. In number 10 here, if I wanted to just solve this, okay, if I just said solve, and I gave you the equation, okay, we have 4 methods for solving a quadratic. We learned how to solve by factoring. We learned how to solve by taking square roots. We learned how to solve by completing the square. We learned how to solve by the quadratic formula, okay? So if you had a choice of those 4 methods, how would you choose to solve this problem? What is it? What'd you say? Square roots, that's how I would choose it as well. I would solve by square roots because there is only an x squared in the whole thing. So if I can isolate the x squared, I can solve the problem. Okay? So I'm going to work this two ways, by the way, for those of you who are copying down what I'm doing. So if I'm solving this by square roots, I divide both sides by -8, and I get x squared equals positive 20 over 8 is 5 halves. Well, now I square root both sides. So x equals positive and negative square root of 5 over the square root of 2. I don't like having square roots in the denominator. So remember, we talked about this briefly before. Some of you remembered it from algebra. We rationalize our denominator, which means we multiply the top and bottom by the square root of 2. And I get x equals positive and negative square root of 10 over 2. Okay? That's a fairly quick way of solving this problem. Not too bad. Okay? But in this particular problem, did we get the choice of how to solve this guy? No, I told you in the instructions, solve by the quadratic formula. You don't have a choice. You have to solve it by the quadratic formula. Just like on our previous quiz, I told you to solve by completing the square. Some of you solved by factoring. Therefore, you got points taken off, even if you had the right answer, because you solved by the wrong method. If the instructions say solve, then you get a pick. If the instructions say solve by this method, then you have to use that method. Okay? So in this case, we are supposed to be solving by the quadratic formula. So let's go back to the original, and let's see how we would do that by the quadratic formula. What do I need to do first here? I need to add 20 to both sides. All right, well, by adding 20 to both sides, I get negative 8x squared plus 20 equals 0. We don't have a b term, so we've got to put it in there. Negative 8x squared plus 0x plus 20 equals 0. Okay? Well, now we can go ahead and use our quadratic formula. So our a is negative 8, our b is 0, and our c is 20. So let's go ahead and work this out. X equals negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Put in your parentheses for your substitution. All right, what are we plugging in for a? Negative 8, yep. What are we plugging in for b? 0, and c? Positive 20. All right, well, negative 0 makes no sense. It's just 0. So we have then positive and negative square root. Well, 0 squared is just 0. And so we now have a negative 4 times negative 8 times times positive 20. So let's see here. Negative 8 times 20 is a negative 80. Negative 80 times negative 8. Well, what's 8 times 8? 64. So we have a positive 640. Oops. So we have a positive 640 over negative 16. All right, well, we got to reduce this stuff down. We got to reduce this stuff down. By the way, just so that you guys are aware of it, had we at the beginning factored out a negative 4 from everything and gotten rid of a negative 4, a factor of negative 4, we wouldn't have to reduce as much at the end. Okay, we still need to reduce, but it wouldn't be as much. Okay, so keep that in mind. Look for those GCFs. All right, but I wanted you guys to practice reducing, so that's why I took you this far. So here we go. Positive and negative square root of 640 over negative 16. What is the biggest perfect square that can be factored out of 640? Here's the thing. think about it. Don't just dive right into the process I taught you. The process is if you can't think of anything. If you're sitting there for 30 seconds or more thinking about it, you need to go through the process. The issue with the process is that if you take 640 and cut it in half, you get 320. There's a lot of perfect squares less than 320 to try. Or you can look at that and say, wait a minute, 640, that's 64 times 10. Can the square root of 10 be reduced? No. So therefore, that's it. We're going to break that into the square root of 64 times the square root of 10, which means we have positive and negative 8 square root of 10 over negative 16. Now we need to reduce. Now we need to reduce. We can break this into two numbers. Our two answers are going to be positive 8 square root of 10 over negative 16 and negative 8 square root of 10 over negative 16. Something that I need you guys to be aware of here is the placement of negatives in a fraction. Okay? The placement of negatives in a fraction. If I have negative 1/2, I got the negative sitting out in front of the whole fraction. Negative 1/2. That is the same thing as negative 1 divided by 2. Would you agree? Yeah. That's the same thing as positive 1 divided by a negative 2. Would you agree with that? Yes. Well, is that the same thing as negative 1 divided by a negative 2? No. Okay, you can't put the negative on both. If the negative's out in front of the fraction, you can't put it on both. It's one or the other. And it doesn't matter which one. So if we take a look here at that first fraction we're dealing with, if we're taking a look right here, I can reduce 8 and negative 16. I get a negative 2 in the bottom. Well, I want to bring that negative to the top. It's negative square root of 10 over 2. Okay? I don't want negatives in my denominator. That's the point. I don't want negatives in my denominator. So I reduced the 8 and the negative 16. I got negative 2 in the denominator. Just bring the negative to the top, just like we did with the 1/2 in the corner up there as my example. How about the second fraction? Negative 8 over negative 16. The negatives cancel. We get a 2 in the bottom. We have square root 10 over 2. Okay. So what's going on here? Well, our final answer then, you could leave it as the two fractions separated like that. Or you could put it back together and say that it's positive and negative square root of 10 over 2. Take a look at that. From this step to this step, what we did is we, of course, canceled the 8 and the 16. We reduced that, right? That's where the 2 came from. But also we reduced a negative from the bottom. That negative in the bottom went away because I'm canceling it with the positive and negative at the top. But if I cancel it with the positive and negative on the top, I still end up with a positive and negative on top. Why? Because the positive aspect right here, that was the positive 8. When I reduce that with a negative 2 in the bottom, it becomes the negative answer. The negative answer, when I reduce that with a negative on the bottom, it becomes the positive answer. Okay? So when you're reducing a negative out of the denominator, if you have a plus and minus on top, it just stays plus and minus on top, but the negative on the bottom goes away. So, did you have to go through this whole step? No. You could have just said 8, negative 16. Remember, that's plus and minus on top, canceling out that negative from the bottom. Okay? All right, this entire worksheet is your assignment today.